Craig Moser Pinky. I think probably that everybody that knows me that was in the paper was founded in April 13th, 1877 by my great-grandfather, Cyrus F. And he was a Civil War veteran and quite a man. Got quite a history. He was in the state legislature for 2 terms in Indianapolis. He was a prosecuting attorney in DeKalb County. He had a law degree. I did not even know that until lately. And then my grandfather also followed in his footsteps. He took over the paper after me. I'll read the whole history so you get it all in order. But my grandfather then took the paper over from my great-grandfather, and he also served in the Indiana legislature. And then, of course, it passed on down to my father, and then it didn't get passed down because I'm the black sheep. I didn't want to be anything to do with the newspaper because as a kid, that's all I did was work at the Banner office. I didn't like part of it. So anyway, that's the way it was. But anyway, I'd like to. Hopefully, this is informative. I'll try to give some continuity to it so you can follow along. I think first I'm going to read what I have here. You'll have to forgive my phone because some of the stuff I have is only on the phone. I looked up this website. It's called Bristol Banner Books, and it's a website that was somebody purchased, I'm assuming, right, Rosemary?
Yes, she purchased it.
And it has all kinds of things for you to supposedly you have to do with Bristol, but it's pretty sketchy. But there is one thing down here that was pretty interesting. It says, what does Bristol Banner Books do? And I'll read you this transcript here. This tells the story of my great-grandfather founding the paper and how it was passed down in the years, etc. It says, what does a Bristol Banner book do? And it says, Cyrus F. Moser founded the Bristol Banner in Bristol, Indiana. He was a man of vision who realized that the occurrences of this day would be the history of tomorrow. The Bristol Banner would document events as well as provide a platform for giving his opinions about them. Thus, a weekly town newspaper was born. Presses began to roll on April 13th, 1877. It was the first newspaper in Elkhart County, and I thought that was quite interesting. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Cyrus ran the operation until, and did the editing, voiced his opinions, and delivered the latest news for 11 years. Over the next 10 years, it was leased to 3 separate parties, whom I did not realize this, who were still under the watchful eye of Cyrus. He oversaw the content and how the paper was being run by whoever he must have had for an editor. And I'm assuming this assumption fell into the same time he was serving in Indianapolis, is what I'm kind of thinking. So he couldn't be both a newspaper editor and also in the legislature at the same time. So I think that's how that all played out. The next 10 years was leased to 3 we're still under the watchful eye of Cyrus. Cyrus's opinions and ideas were so well received that despite the town of Bristol only having 600 residents, the Bristol Banner had a paid subscriber list of 2,500 people. That was considerable back then. Having practiced law and having a large following also gave him the opportunity to serve 2 terms in the Indiana State Legislature. By 1898, Cyrus' son, Horace H., my grandfather, was deemed old enough to take over the management and editing duties of the Bristol Banner. The weekly journals continued, and H.H., as he was called, also served in the Indiana State Legislature. He was an advocate for progress in his columns as well as in the legislative halls of Indianapolis. H.H. operated the paper for 50 years and raised his son to follow in the family's footsteps. Born in 1918, Horace Red F. Moser began working at the paper as a youngster. His duties were sweeping and packing scrap metals and other necessary but mundane chores. In 1936, he began working as a linotype operator. For those who have no idea what a linotype is, it was a machine that cast lead slugs, probably 2.5 inches long, very thin, and they were type 12 point?
Yeah.
I think it was 12 point, and they formed columns, and then the columns were printed in the newspaper. You've read newspapers and they always, go like this. Each one of those columns would be the length of the lead, and the thicknesses would be whatever type font they were using to make it. But he would take the transcript, what it would be, he'd type it into this machine. This machine had 10,000 moving parts. And to be a journeyman linotype operator, you had to be able to completely disassemble the machine and put it back into working order. That's part of the plus learning how to run it, and also you had a prerequisite for how many words a minute you could do it, you know, because these things, you typed it in and these little, what do you call those things, mats?
Yeah, I think so.
There were little brass things that looked like sawtooths on them, and they'd come down from this magazine on top of this machine. It comes down through the trough. When you hit the key on the keyboard, then one of these caricatures would come down and filter its way over into a column about this long. And that would be like you'd spell out a sentence, and then you'd spell a word, drop a spacer, spell a word, drop a spacer, spell a word, drop a spacer, and of course punctuation and everything else was a keystroke. All capitals were on a separate keyboard, all lowercase were on the left-hand keyboard, and all the numbers and all punctuation was on that board too. And it didn't run like a typewriter. It wasn't set up like a typewriter. It was an entirely separate way of skill set. So it was quite complicated, actually. But anyway, these would come down, and then he'd triple lever, and this thing would go over in front of a lead pot that had a spinning wheel that would face itself against these mats and cast a lead slug with that sentence on it, and then it would put it in order in a little tray. So when you're all done, it was all in order, as the way it came off the transcript. The thing about newspaper printing at the time is that everything that a printer did was upside down and backwards. He had to be able to read upside down and backwards because it had to be printed, and when it was printed, it was like a negative that would go to right side up in the way you would read it. So my dad and my grandpa and everybody that ever worked with the paper, including us, we could do that. You learn how to read backwards and upside down. Just part of the equation. But here's how intricate this gets. So here we are, we're at the linotype, and we cast this. This is the easy part. The linotype was actually the fastest and easiest part of the newspaper. Everything else was handset type. Little tiny pieces of lead, and they all had a caricature on them, upside down and backwards. And they'd have this little tray. My grandpa, I just loved watching him. He always wore a green sun visor, and he had these rubber bands they put on their sleeves back in them days, you know. And he could sit down there, and he could take this stuff out of those boxes. Have you ever seen a type tray?
Yeah.
I think most everyone's familiar with the type tray that had the little compartments in it. A lot of people use it for curios. Mm-hmm. But anyway, each one of those had a total alphabet and a number of, you know, they figured out how many A's they would use, B's, C's, and D's, and they'd have that many in there for most anything you'd want to handset. But the remarkable part of this is he could set this with punctuation now and spacing. Legal type. Anybody understand how small legal type is in a newspaper? It's the tiniest. It's about 14 or 16 point, because the county and state don't want to pay a lot of money to get all their legal notices in newspapers, because for you to be, you have to notify the public in a public forum of whatever that legislative was, or the suit, or whatever else it might be. So, but my grandfather could sit there, and these things were, I mean, legals, that was where the money was, actually. But he could handset those things as fast as you watch your head. And then he got done, and they'd all be in this little tray, and they'd have to put them in this little square cast iron box, and in order, and then all spaced out and screwed down with these little clamps, and it all had to be exactly the right height, because it wouldn't print when it went through the flatbed press. So they'd have to take trial runs through the press, and if it was a little low, Dad would pick these heavy suckers up, and they'd weigh 150, 160 pounds. He'd pick them up and have to put a little piece of paper under there to get enough strike so it would print. So they'd have to run this through the machine until they got it so it printed well. And before it ever got to that, I'm going to have to back up here.
Can I throw something in real quick?
Oh, yeah.
With the printing, the cases, because we used to do that. And how many of you know today we talk about uppercase and lowercase? Mm-hmm. Capital letters? Yeah. That's where it came from. The capital letters were on the top of the tray. The larger letters were on the bottom of the case. And they were called California job cases. And it's just stuck even today.
You're right. Yeah. And all measurements in a printing shop were they had its own tape measures and own rulers. They didn't follow the inch or metric. It had to do with fonts and letter heights, and all their scales were so that they could measure the length of a column of type so it would fit in whatever space they had to put it in. So they had entirely different measuring system also. So this is quite complicated. After they set this linotype or handset, then they put it in this little, I don't know what you'd call it, it was a hand roller. You ever seen some of the old movies where they got this leather thing and the guy's putting ink on these things, and then he puts a piece of paper in and puts down the cover and then brings down, that's called a Washington hand press. Well, anyway, each one of those fonts we were talking about are put into one of this little tray, and Grandpa would go over there and he had a roller with 2 handles on it, must have weighed 50 pounds, remember? And he put the type in there, it was type I, and then he'd put a piece of paper over it, and then he'd roll it, and then he'd proofread it. Now, you don't see that happening anymore. One thing about the newspaper business at that time, it was absolutely unthinkable for punctuation and grammar to be wrong. It was a sin for a printer. So Grandpa would then take these, and they had a shorthand system. So that anything was wrong within that font, he'd just draw an arrow from it, and he'd be a little symbol telling you what was needed correcting. Spelling, grammar, punctuation, whatever. And he'd go through that whole thing, read it all over again. And then he'd make all these. And then it would go back to my dad or whoever was running the linotype, and they'd have to pick each one of those slugs out that was misrepresented, and they'd have to redo it and put it back in there. So it was very, very important that you got it right the first time, because it was too labor consuming to go back and make a lot of changes for the mistakes you might have made. Kind of like drafting. Engineers, when they was making a regular paper drawing, they were much more meticulous because it took a lot of work to change a drafting. You might change the first layer, and it would cause you to change every layer after it because you had that error in the first one. So there was a lot of check and balance that we don't have anymore. They just rely on something that has absolutely no idea what the English language is all about. You can read the paper, any paper today, and you'll find typographical errors and misspellings and punctuation, and English and grammar was out of the question. That's not part of the equation anymore. The other thing I would like to bring up is very important, and it's still important to me because we don't get it anymore. There was no such thing as editorialized news except on the editorial page. Dad and Grandpa had a page, and it was called the editorial page. That was their opinion page, and it was also labeled as such, as their personal opinion. Everything else in that paper was printed as factual as they possibly could get it, and it was very important. So that you didn't get a bunch of, whether it was good, bad, or ugly, you got the news, and then you got to make up your own mind as to what content and how to evaluate what you're reading. But it was the news. You didn't have to worry about somebody else telling you what the paper was saying. You read it and you made your own evaluation. So I thought it's a wonderful concept. We just don't have it anymore. All news today is editorialized, all of it. There is no such thing as news. It's somebody's slant on whatever they've seen, and for whatever political reasons they can use it. So that's the way that goes. I shouldn't keep rattling without giving the opportunity. Anybody have any kind of a question that popped into their mind up to this point? I've got lots more.
Let me just comment. Sure. I have one of those linotypes with my name on it.
You do?
When we were Cub Scouts, we went to the Bristol Banner, and your dad made that.
Yep.
For all the kids.
Well, we used to get them, and then you put pennies in them. Remember, John? Mm-hmm. I don't know what happened to mine, but every kid that ever walked in the Banner office pretty much ended up with a slug with his name on it someplace. But Dad used to cast pennies in them. I don't know how he did it, but he'd get a penny in there too. And I got them stuffed away someplace. I just haven't bumped into them yet. But it was pretty interesting. I have a whole bunch of stuff here that gives you some idea of what it looked like. This press that they used, the original press for the Bristol Banner was a Washington hand press, the original one. I don't know what year it I know this press that Dad ran was built in 1882. So I don't know how long they used the Washington hand press or if they had anything before that. But that's the only one I remember, and that's the only one my grandfather remembers. But I know for a fact that it was a Washington hand press, the original one. And to the best of my knowledge, and I have no physical proof of this, the original Bristol Banner building was between Hawkins, used to be, there's a barn there. What was it? You know where we used to have free movies when we were kids? That lot? It ran back to the cabin back there on the river, on the hill down at the river. There was where the hole in the wall was, and then there was a river in there. Then there was an open lot where we had free movies, and then there was Sample. The old Sample livery barn that was there, and Hawkins. Well, anyway, that area at one time had a building there, and it was a single story with a porch, kind of a porch front on it, and that was where the Banner originated at. I have absolutely no luck trying to find out when the Bristol Banner was built, the one that is now the tool shed. You know, Ed?
1915,
15?
same year the town hall was built.
See,
Red Moser.
I would surely like to know because I can't find anything. I've looked up, I've even got the abstract for the place and I can't find it. So I'm going to send some pictures around and you can all kind of look at them. And the first one I'm going to send here is my dad, and he's kind of standing there looking at it, probably wondering, oh boy, another day, another dollar. But it kind of shows the galleys down here and the type set in them. And this big drum roll here would take the papers off a feed table and roll them across the face of the type. And then there would be this, looked like a hay rake, would pick the paper up and transport it onto a stand. And that would be the first 4 pages. And then they would have to flip them and put them back up there, reset all the galleys for the second 4 pages of the newspaper. So he had to run the paper through twice to get the whole thing. And then when we were kids, one of the things that we made money at was folded newspapers. Dad hired probably every kid that was able to, or even one to try out, fold newspapers. That was pretty much always my job. I always had to do that. John was quite good at it. Eddie used to do it. Anyway, you had to put these big pages on the table the right way, and then you had this string with a block of wood on it that you pulled over the middle of the paper, and you'd fold it over to the left, and you'd crease it, and you'd rip it open. Now that made 8 pages right there, see? And then you'd fold it up once, you'd fold it over twice, flip and one more time, and then that was a folded newspaper. You open it up, and you'd read it like 8 pages. But you had to do every one of those. Every one of those. But we got a penny apiece. That was big bucks, boy. You got as good as you could. Yeah.
So how many did you do at a time? I mean,
Well, it said 2,500. At one time they did 2,500, but I think we had about 800 or 900 altogether. But it took a long
A
time.
good night would be $250 for one person.
Yeah, yeah. $2.50, but in the 40s, late 40s and early 50s, that's a lot of money. That's big bucks, boy. I'll tell you. Anyway, I'm going to pass these over here. I'll start with Larry over here. He can.
Well, I haven't seen it.
Well, you have seen it.
This was I remember your dad said this was a Country Camel was the name of the press.
Well, I've got the original flywheel off that thing, and there's going to make a coffee table out of it. Never got it done. The wooden one. First picture is the flatbed press that the paper was printed off of. The second one is my father sitting at a linotype with the keyboard in front of him.
What year was that?
Huh?
What year was that?
I think all these are early 50s. And then we had a job press, which was, this was an old job press because some of these early pictures of the Banner, that job press is still it's in the pictures, and so is the Camelback right over here. The press that you're talking about right there. Anyway, there's Dad at the job press. Now, the job printing was letterheads, business envelopes, business cards, etc. Almost, and that was really the bread and butter of that whole paper. But Dad hated it. He hated that. It was too repetitious for him. He liked putting the newspaper together. That was his thing. And so I ended up having to run that sucker for all the time I was a kid. And he was right about the repetition part, but it was a finger getter. You got to be careful. It had a lever on, and if you push the lever forward, well, then it wouldn't quite close the gap, you know. So if you got one misplaced or something, you'd quick throw the lever, and then it'd open up, you'd straighten it out again, and start it, and then print them again. But every one of those had to go in there, and they were all set so that they would come out wherever you wanted them on the sheet of paper, you know, 8.5 by 11 in the middle, the letterhead on top, and you hand fed them. And of course, you could get it going as fast as you wanted. But boy, you didn't want to ever get your fingers in that thing, man. That would have been it. You wouldn't have had it anymore. So far, got them all. Anyway, here's another picture of my dad on the job press.
Hanky,
Yeah.
explain the condition of the room when he was running the linotype.
You mean
Everything was yellow.
pretty much? Yeah, that's from lead fumes. Yeah.
Yeah.
We breathe it.
I grew up. That's why I'm so addled. I'm 80 years old and I'm stupid as can be because I breathed lead fumes all my life. See what happens? So anyway, I'm a little bit of a skeptic about that. I'm assuming that probably in an individual case, that's probably true, that lead is definitely a bad thing for you. But I grew up with it my whole entire life and everybody in my family. And of course, my father didn't live to be an old man. He was only 71. But anyway, we'd walk down to the manor office, and there was days I'd go down in there and go down the stairs from the front office, and you couldn't see the back of the room for the yellow smoke, just lead fumes.
There's a lot of cigarette smoke.
Oh yeah, cigarette smokes too. Yeah, yeah. But it was totally a lead operation. That was true. I have a picture here. I'm fairly sure this would be the west side of the hole in the wall, or not the hole in the wall, the tool shed, excuse me. And it was a bedroom when I was a kid. They'd moved the paper from the ground floor to the basement by the time I was around. But originally it had started on the main floor, and this would have been the west end, and the first two windows over there would have been what I remember as bedroom windows facing Vistula Street. But this is my grandfather behind this jack of all trades thing, which I have no idea what that is. But it has the original job press here, and if you look back behind behind him to the right, there's a guy back here with his elbow on sitting there kind of in the picture. I don't know who he is. I'm pretty sure this gal over here is my Aunt Marie, but I'm not positive. But my grandfather is the one with the mustache right behind the jack of all trades thing here. But that is the original job press, the one I ran, and that is the original camelback press that the paper was printed off of.
These had the line shaft.
Yeah, this is still steam driven probably. Yeah. Oh, that's my great grandfather. He's the one that started the paper. He's also on this side, and the house over here on the right is my family home. Wade still lives in the house down here. And to the best of my knowledge, it's the oldest house in Bristol. It was built in 1834. I have a whole bunch of news articles, especially about when the paper was finally shut down. And there was some very nice things written about my father and my family. And I will send those around. And if you want to take the time to look at them, you can. Most of this stuff you can find online, actually, if you really look for it. This was printed in the Elkhart Truth, and it says ink runs through the veins of Bristol's red Moser, and it has him standing by his great-grandfather's tombstone up here in the Episcopal Cemetery, and it shows his rank in the Civil War and his unit. And that's an interesting read. If you go out there and find the Moser tombstone, it'll have Lieutenant Moser on there, and it'll give his unit that he was in the Civil War. And you can look that up online. And it's contradictory. You'll have one that tells you that he was a hero, and then you'll tell one that he was not that cool. However, what I'm finding out is that my grandfather had quite an affinity for his men. He took good care of his men. He was in the Battle of the Cumberland, so it was a terrible That was down in Kentucky, and it was a horrible part of the Civil War. It really was. Very miserable conditions. And anyway, long story short, there was a story that went through our family that said that my grandfather and his men had just got through with a battle, and they were around the campfire trying to get their wind back, and he's totally exhausted, and some captain came in and ordered them back in the line, and they weren't able to do it. And I guess my grandfather told them to pretty well stick it. And the story goes that they got in a fist fight, and Grandpa knocked him through the fire. And back in that time, I know my grandfather was enlisted in the Union Army twice, okay? That's the only thing I got to go by here. But back then, they hired their officers. If you were officer material, and if you went through like a military academy, which my grandfather did, he went through Culver's. And so he had military training, and the government actually hired them to be officers over men. And he was hired. So I guess the story goes that Grandpa said, I quit before he got shot, pretty much. But there's a lot to be said about what happened down there. And I don't know if there's any relevance to that or not. That's what I heard as a kid. So, but if you go online and if you're that interested, you want to look it up, it is an interesting read. It just gives you kind of a little insight as to what these men really went through in their life, and it was not pretty. It was a horrible time. This one was printed in the Bristol Banner after he had relinquished the name to whoever purchased it. Who was the lady?
Marcy somebody.
Yeah, I don't remember the name of the individual. This was a Christmas edition, and it was December 16th, 1988. And it says the village printer read Moser in the town paper. And it's a very nice article about my dad. And anyway, it'd take too long for me to read each one of these, but I'll pass them around and you can scan it if you'd like, or look at it or whatever. This is kind of an interesting little article here. If I could read it, my eyesight's pretty shot anymore, so bear with me. Apart from the economics of running a small news operation, Moser remains enchanted with newspapers. But he takes a hard line on news policy concerning such matters as viewpoint. And he's talking about, my news education taught me that the reporters are not supposed to express opinions in their writing, Moser commented. In a small community particularly, it is important to remain objective about news, he commented. I don't like to read reporters' personal opinions when I pick up a newspaper, but that's the liberal inclination of the media today, and that was back in 1983. What's changed? You know, not much, has it? But I told you the way that my family viewed the news.
So your paper was the Republican version?
Yes.
And then Goshen was
News Democrat.
Democrat.
Yeah.
Okay.
And yeah, Elkhart Truth was whatever Elkhart Truth was.
Right.
And that was not disparaging. I wasn't supposed to be disparaging. So, my father actually worked for the Elkhart Truth for 19 years as a linotype operator and a makeup man. So he had to take a second job to keep the newspaper running because he never made enough money down there to keep the doors open. So Dad, well, anyway, he was a hard-working son of a gun. That's all I got to tell you. And it was all over a promise he made his father that he would at least keep the paper running for 100 years. Wow. So he kept his promise plus 6, something like that. I was 106 years old, I think, when he retired. And although a good number of small publications have folded over the years, including the Banner, Moser is optimistic that most will survive. Well, they didn't actually. Most of them turned into like the paper, which is fine. They gave out a free newspaper and charged for advertising in that law. So they distributed over a lot of area with no cost to the advertising.
And it's gone now.
Yeah, but that's how the papers, the small town papers, evolved from being a weekly to being a weekly, might as well say an advertisement for business resources. Little news and a lot of advertisement.
Yeah, Pink, on that line, did your dad go out and actively try to sell advertising?
Oh my goodness, Fridays was advertising day. And Mom and I had to hop in that 49 Chevy and go to Goshen and Elkhart all day Friday. Got up early and he went to every store in Elkhart that subscribed, that put advertisement in the paper, and they gave him a list of what they wanted printed for their next week's sale. So he'd get that to bring back and put into the paper for promotion and stuff.
Zimmy up at Zimmy's Tavern.
That's where I was going.
Okay.
That was the best
he,
ad ever.
he ran an ad for years that said Zimmy's
Open
now
7 days
open
a week.
7 days a week, closed Mondays. He ran
That's where I was
that
going.
ad. He ran that ad for years.
Well, here's the best part of that.
Every Saturday, we would check to see if he was gonna be closed Monday.
My grandfather was totally humiliated by that. Zimmy and my family were very good friends. Grandpa and Zimmy were buddies. I don't know how, you can take that for whatever it's worth. But Zimmy was quite a character. But anyway, long story short, Zimmy started advertising in the Banner, and he told my grandpa, he says, well, Grandpa asked him how would you like it advertised. He says, you just use your own words, Horace, and I'll be happy with it. So Grandpa put that in. But it was an accident. And it got out and got sent out, and my grandpa was so apologetic. He went out to Zimmy's, he personally went to Zimmy's Tavern and told Zimmy he was so sorry about the misprint, and that he'd give him free advertisement for X number of weeks for the mistake he made and correct it. And Zimmy says, oh, no you won't. He says, I want it run just like that from here on out. And it was run that way forever. Forever. He was tickled to death with it.
When we were kids, when they would deliver the Banner every Saturday, we'd show up at the house and we'd run out and get the Banner. You look for 3 things. You look for Zimmy's ad, see if they were still closed Monday. You look for the Little League scores, and then you'd try to figure out what Ori E. Ziegler was doing over there at the deal over in Jefferson Township.
Yeah, I kind of reiterated what it takes to print the paper as far as the mechanics of it was concerned, but it was a lot more involved than that because you had to have correspondence all over the area. Every township had a volunteer correspondent that would tell about their neighborhood news, and then they would take that news and they'd give it to my dad so it could be printed as, local news. And it was quite an ordeal. And of course, he was very, very careful about who he chose for his correspondence because he didn't want slander and people that would, give their own slanted version of whatever's happened in the neighborhood. But it was quite a responsibility for those people that would take that position, because they kind of open themselves up for libel if you're not careful.
Well, the Zieglers and Bayners did a great job.
Yes, they
because
did.
we knew what they were going to have
Yes.
for dinner on.
Pretty much.
And the Hillbishes.
And the Hilbishes too,
And
yeah.
Hillbish, yeah.
Yeah. But anyway, that's how the local news was established. And
Yeah.
of course, if you lived in the community, there was always something going around someplace that was newsworthy. It's always interesting. But like I said, Friday was soliciting day, and he'd go down and he'd go to Raps and Goldberg's and Suntimers Hardware, and all the Elkhart businesses were at one time advertised. But that was quite a chore. He had to make a personal appearance each one of these stores, and he would pick up whatever they wanted in the paper for that week, and then he'd have to go back and set it, and then make sure it made in the paper for the next week. So you think, daily newspapers are the thing now, well, they don't, there's none of that composition anymore. It's all photographic and digitized, and you can take a guy off the street right now and you can teach him how to cut and paste in about 2-3 hours, and he can sit down here and compose a newspaper. It's not hard, but it's a lot different when you have to cast lead mats against a great big piece of lead and all the work that goes into it. I mean, there was a great big metal saw down there. You had to cut these things out to fit after you casting them. And if the lead pot wasn't just quite hot enough, he'd cast them for nothing, and they'd have holes in them, and you'd have to melt it all down, start all over again. It was just a lot of work.
And then all those letters from the last printing were melted down for.
Oh yeah, from the linotype, yeah. Except if they were something that was archivable. He used to keep the ones that were really important. And some of them were repetitious, like Zimmy's. Zimmy's was kept.
Yeah.
So it'd be inserted the next week into that space. He just bought that space. So those would be kept. And of course, there were some things that were of historical value at that time, and we'd keep them aside. He kept a lot of the legal type because, number one, it was handset, and they'd had to pass inspection by the county before they'd pay him for the legal. And that was another story we won't go to.
I went to college in 1961. I was an industrial arts major, and one of the classes I took was printing. And the professor was, I did that thing, you had this little thing you held in your hand that you'd set your type in. I'd sit there, and he was, where'd you learn to do that? He was totally amazed that I could set type like that. I said, well, I grew up in a newspaper, I don't know, and it was, we need to have some Banner Office stories.
Why? Oh, there's one other here I want to read out of this article, and I won't bore you with it anymore. It's, after spending his entire career in the news business, Moser hesitates to say that he'd do what he would do with his spare time, but he has given it some thought. And he says, there's an old adage that claims that retired printers go to the devil or the ministry. Moser says softly, and says, my brother became an Episcopal priest, so I suppose I had better watch my step. Anyway, there's that little article. You can pass that around there too, John, if you want to.
How are you connected to Father Moser?
There's my uncle.
Your uncle wrote a whole series of
I got 'em.
booklets there at the library. Those are really interesting.
Yeah, I got a few of them. Yeah, Uncle Bruce was a character.
Yes, he was.
Drank beer, smoked cigarettes, and played the piano. Drank wine. Excuse me, he liked wine.
He married my grandpa and grandma.
Oh, I haven't doubt that. Yeah. Yeah. He married a lot of people, actually.
When we were over, it was a Wednesday night, we pulled the papers, the paper came out on Thursday. Whatever night it was, his grandpa would address him, and he lived in the apartment above. So we're down there folding paper, and when he'd run out, he'd take his cane and bang, 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 he'd hit the floor, and one of us would run upstairs with a whole bunch of papers, and he hand addressed every one of them for years.
We all did that. And then Dad finally bought a stencil machine that you could run them in there and, you know. But I hand addressed him. He did. That was just part of the equation. That's a lot of writing. You start putting addresses on individual papers. And then those were called single wrapped. Each one of those newspapers that went to a rural address were single wrapped. They take the newspaper and a piece of newsprint, and he made glue out of paste and water. Still remember that. There were white flour and water that made paste, paper paste. And then you take the newspaper and you'd fold it in thirds. And you'd put the first one, you put the wrapper in it, and then you roll it on over, and then you would seal it on the back side, and then it would, it would be not much bigger than so, and then the address would go on it. You had to roll them so the address shone after it was handwritten. And then he'd take all these down to the post office, and they were all individually mailed out to the customers out. Well, this is a caricature of my grandfather, and Larry sent me this, and I got this to print out, Larry. I don't know how I did that. But anyway, it says about my grandfather as a legislator. It says, courtesy of the Indianapolis Sentinel, which was a newspaper at that time, Representative Moser, when at his home, wields a blue pencil in the manner familiar to all editors. His paper is one of the organs of the majority up in Elkhart County. Mr. Moser is one of the best-known Republican editors of the state. As a member of the House, he has shown that he is one of the is of the timber. I'm having a trouble seeing this. From which statesmen are made. In debate, he is a witty speaker, and at the same time, his oratory is of a high grade. Bills receive his careful attention, and he is at all times working hard for the interest of his constituents. He is the present worshipful master of the Masonic Lodge in Bristol. Well, this is a very interesting here. This is just a little clipping from an old advertisement, and it's got my grandfather's handwriting on here, and it had something to do with the cost factor, and it's called Township School Wagons. It's the Lewis and Nelville Manufacturing Company of Goshen, Indiana, and it shows a horse-drawn school bus of the era, and it's got a bill of lading on the back of it here, but I think that's worth your time to look at over there. This is a catalog from a merchant way back when. Rosemary can have this one. I'm done with this one. But this goes to show you the kind of advertising that was out there, and this is in 1927. It's kind of a little book, and some of the stuff was probably somebody's looking for free advertising in the banner, somebody to promote the catalog or whatever. But it just gives you an idea. It's got tires in it, it's got automotive parts and fans, and it's kind of like a hardware thing, and the cost of them, and the cost will just blow your mind. Just blow your mind. This desk that I will show, this is in the room that I was talking about earlier. Evidently, he converted this into the office, the one that had the machines in it originally with the, jack of all trade thing there, my grandpa. So by that time, they had moved the presses out of that room because there's no longer line action here. But the two front windows are still here, and these two libraries I remember as a kid, but they were in the apartment. But I own this desk, and if you'll look over here on the right-hand side, it's got the captain's chairs, of which I have two of. We still have those, and this swivel rocker, I still have that. This is a good story, and I'll make it real quick. My grandpa was in the Civil War, and he was stationed in the Cumberland in Kentucky. And I can't tell you how I found it. It's on the internet someplace. I think it has to do with his history in the war. But it had a copy of a letter that he had wrote to his wife's father, a Dr. Rowe, and a Dr. Rowe fought in the Civil War and the Spanish or the Mexican Wars. And evidently he had been stationed someplace south of Kentucky because my grandfather was kind of hoping he'd run into him. But the letter was written, he says, I have yet to meet you, but he married my grandmother already, or my great-grandmother, without permission. He just married him and wanted to meet his in-law dad, So he wrote this letter and says, this isn't exactly the way I planned on breaking the news to you, but it's cold and I got nothing else to do. I'm going to write you this letter. And so he tells his father-in-law that he married his daughter, unbeknownst to him. And I don't know how that all came about, and I ain't asking. So I just know that it's true, and it's pretty cool. Okay, this is the front of the Banner building, and I got out a magnifying glass. I tried to figure out who these kids are. They could be my dad and Aunt Grace. They could be the Houts from Middlebury. I'm not sure. I do know my grandpa, and he's the one in the middle with the apron on, and I'm not sure about the rest of the people. But this is what the Banner office looked like, probably prior 40s. I'd say this is probably in the 20s or 30s, because there was an outside stairwell, you remember that ran up this side of the building, and it isn't here in this photograph. But it kind of gives you an idea what the front of the building looked like back then. I can't date it, but that's my grandpa, and I would say it's probably in the 30s. I'm guessing I'd say the 30s. Maybe before that, if my dad's in it, he was born in 18, and those kids are only about 6 or 7 years old. So, anyhow, I'm going to send this picture around, and I'm not going to elaborate on it. This is my dad, and this is my daughter Tracy, whom I love dearly. And I just love that picture. I wish I had the picture, but all I have is a newspaper with the picture. To show her with her grandpa. I think one of the highlights of the Bristol Banner was our generation. That was pretty much our home away from home. My dad was a you might as well say he babysitted most of the young boys in Bristol to keep them out of jail. And I think he did a pretty good job. He missed the boat a couple times, but most of the time he kept us pretty straight. But we had a place to go. We played cards. He didn't judge us or give us a lot of flack, but he had rules, and they would be followed, or you would pay the penalty for it. There was nothing illicit or illegal or anything that wasn't moral down there. Well, unless there's any questions, I think that's probably as good as I can do for now. If I come up with anything of interest, I would certainly be able to pass it on.